So today I'm going to be talking about narrative-focused video games. So that's the type of video games that I have been making with Ren'Py, which is an open source engine based on Python. So just a little bit about myself. As part of Quill Studios, which is the game studio that I started, mostly consisting of myself. I'm the developer, the writer, project management, and uh, amateur marketing. And as my day job, or just like the other things that I do, I also co-organize ACE, which is a machine learning, used to be Meetup in person, but now, of course, it's live stream. So you can actually check them out. The URL is ai.science, and that's a real URL. We had to purchase that. And I'm a data scientist at a company called Clearbank, which is a fintech company based in Toronto. And I also, as someone in the audience earlier mentioned, I write about data science and game development and some other things like time management and productivity at susanshu.com. So feel free to check that out as well. So about the game development part, like why did I start and what happened here and how did I use Python to do this? So I started this project, I would say in late 2017, but actually I'm not exactly sure. At the time, I was actually a full-time student, and then I was writing this story script, which has 70,000 words actually. So that took quite a long time to do because surprisingly, creative work is extremely difficult, and there's like more ups and downs and everything. So this project took a long time to do. And apart from the writing, which I could give a totally different talk about, I'm just going to share how Python helped me. So this is the first game that I made, and from the very beginning, I started to make with the mind of making a commercial game, which means that I was going to sell it. Namely, it wasn't going to be for free. So I made this with Ren'Py, which is the engine I'm going to talk about. And I actually launched it last year, 2019, in August on Steam. But then I did another launch, which was on consoles, which was only 3 months ago, and I have sold over 5,000 units, and they're around $10 USD each. But I mean, that's gross. But I guess you can do the math. That was like more than I had really ever expected or like even wanted. So that was a surprising good result. And I'm just going to go a bit more into this. All right, so I'm going to first give a little bit of overview into the gaming industry because I know that people in the audience, right, like everyone probably is familiar with Python or is just getting interested, getting started in Python or other programming languages, but not everyone has necessarily the context of the gaming industry. So I find that to be overall beneficial when giving this talk to non-gaming industry specific audiences. So there are different platforms, and notably there could be like personal computer on multiple OSs like Windows, Linux, or Mac, as well as the three main console platforms, which are Nintendo Switch, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. And all of these have huge presence in North America, but also in all parts of the world, like Asia, Europe. And then like mobile gaming is another huge beast in itself. I'm not going to go too much into that because I personally did not port this game to mobile platforms, but that is also another super prevalent way that you might see the gaming industry in your day-to-day life. And how does one start making games, right? Like the games that you might have heard of and you might know that might be familiar to you could be like the Assassin's Creed franchise or like Overwatch, the FIFA series, or The Last of Us. games that are made by what are called AAA studios, which could be like Ubisoft or Blizzard Activision, that made these games. And these studios usually have the most well-known games to people who maybe play one game or two, extensively. And they are the most well known, and of course also the most well funded, high budget and everything. So when I first started playing games, I kind of started with like these like AAA games, like and then the idea or the impression I got was, okay, if I want to make games, I will have to join a large company, like one that makes this kind of game. I can't really make games by myself. And I mean, it is true that these types of games are typically the ones that are making, let's say, millions of dollars. It's kind of like the movie industry. You hear of a budget of like X million dollars, and then they made like X million dollars after it was launched. And that's just how it seemed to me. Like the scale was really too big for me to think about when I was only familiar with this type of large studio AAA games. But then I started playing more indie games, which is short for independent. So these could be games that are made by smaller teams with smaller budget. It could be like a one person team, as is the case with Stardew Valley and Baba Is You as well. And there are some that are just made with smaller teams like Terraria. And they're all very, very popular games with possibly millions of units sold, a huge player base, but they had a much smaller budget, etc., compared to those AAA games. And of course, there is just some that are more ambiguous. So I guess PUBG is also pretty popular. And then they could be seen as kind of indie. Like they don't have like a massive, massive team like Ubisoft or something. But they also seem to have like a fairly large budget. So yeah, some might be more ambiguous, but at the same time, right? It's like less intimidating when you think that a relatively smaller group of people could make games that are so popular. So that's why I wanted to introduce the idea of, okay, what is different between small teams and indie game developers and like the traditionally large games. And I just want to mention some roles in game development because this is actually something that I did not necessarily start off knowing. I was just like, oh, yeah, I know how to program. Like, let's make a game. Let's go. But it's not really the case. All of these that I have listed play a massive part in getting the game to where it is. So the first one I'm going to mention is narrative design or writing. So even when you're playing a game like Pokemon or something, like you're meeting like these NPCs, like non-player characters, you're meeting these like other people in the game world and they talk, right? There's dialogue. Like someone wrote that. Lots of people wrote that. There was like thousands and thousands of lines of dialogue, the world setting, everything. That's all narrative. And that's not something that can only be conveyed with the art or the, let's say, the engine programmer or something. Like they do not do that. Like the narrative people do that and the writers do that. So those are a big, big part of the game experience, like no matter what kind of game really that you are in. And of course, there's the game programmer, engine or physics developer. There's the producer or project coordinator, which just makes sure that things are on schedule, etc. But actually, producers are credited really highly, like kind of how directors in movies are. Like maybe they don't code, maybe they're not making the art, but they're having like a high level vision that keeps things tight, keeps things like going in the right direction and on time. So they are very, very essential as well. And of course, like we come to the art, and this is like a huge, huge I have a huge amount of respect for all of these roles because when I tried to make a game by myself, I was like, oh, whoops, I guess I have to do a bit of everything as well. And it's hard, very hard. Um, And without like these art, like without the aesthetic, like you wouldn't really be able to recognize these games, right? Like Pokemon games, like you kind of know them from the aesthetic. You might not necessarily think they have like the most fantastic writing or something, but like you would be able to see a Pokemon game and be like, whoa, like that's a Pokemon game. But yeah, you could grow attached to the characters in Pokemon. That's thanks to the writing. So I just wanted to mention that because there's like many ways to enter game development in general as well. So now I'm going to go into how Python helped me and just everything else because I already use it in my full-time job. But I mean, this is kind of like I was learning Python and then I made games and then I got a full-time job which also used Python. So it kind of like was a cycle. I couldn't say like which started the other or everything else. But as a user of Python in general, so for example, at work, right? Like I might use NumPy or yeah, like everything else like pandas, whatever. But they are not something that I use in game development at all. So there is definitely kind of like a new learning curve for me, regardless. And as a Python user, like I would, well, I know and I'm like grateful that there is like great documentation and in games because it's already a very it's like a standard to use object-oriented programming or design. So Python is very good at that. So it was very just kind of like it just kind of aligned in that way, which helped me. So I'm going to go a little bit into the type of games that I can make with Ren'Py, this open source Python based game engine. So there's many different types of games, right? So you might have heard of like Pokemon or other games that I mentioned earlier, but I just want you to like take a step back a little bit at like narrative driven experiences in general. So you might have heard of or seen like Netflix's kind of movie with choices. So this is basically on the Netflix screen. You can see at this point in the movie, I guess, you could there's like gonna be a scenario and you can choose like, oh, accept. And if you accept, like a different scenario plays out. And if you refuse, it like branches out into a different scenario. So there's like different ways you kind of affect the story, even though it's simply like in, I guess, the video medium or movie medium. But it's kind of like an experience that's different from when you're just watching a movie without any interaction. So I'm just going to start from here into kind of seeing what you can do with a narrative driven experience. So there are many popular games in Japan that kind of focus on this kind of experience delivery. So the nonary games or like 999 or like you might have known it from many names like Zero Escape. Like basically it's a franchise that is actually more like a puzzle. It's like a puzzle game where you can actually move around in the environment kind of, and you just have to like find things and you like have to escape like this it's like an escape room mystery puzzle game, but then all throughout there's like a really really kind of deep and complicated story that's being told, and all of that is being told with just like narrative dialogue boxes and some voice acting. So this is different from the puzzle part. But if I just played the puzzle part, I wouldn't really care about this game much at all. But it grew really popular in the West, on like I guess back when it was like the Nintendo DS. That because of the story and the way that it was told, it was extremely popular. So this is one of the examples of how the narrative can help enhance other parts of gameplay. Um, and this is another game that is like really popular as well in North America, which is Persona, like the Persona franchise, or recently Persona 5. So they also use kind of like narrative, like visual novel, which I'm going to just like use the terms interchangeably now because I guess why it's called visual novels because like you're reading a lot of the dialogue. So it's almost like you are reading a novel apart from the gameplay. So that's why it's called that. So even really, really mainstream popular games tend to use this type of narrative design and device. And another really popular series, which is similar, is kind of like mystery, like a little bit horror, I guess, like is Danganronpa. So it also has other gameplay elements that are kind of enhanced with this kind of visual novel storytelling. So I just wanted to really talk about that because those are all fairly mainstream games, and then they use this kind of dialogue to help the player be immersed in the game world as well as tell the story, which actually enhances the gameplay if applicable. But a lot of the games that I have mentioned are actually built by probably larger teams as well, and they probably have like very custom engines, and it's like pretty expensive for me when I'm thinking about in terms of time, like if I have to build something like that by myself. So yeah, they are really, yeah. It's just like intimidating when I think about it, like, oh, how could I make a game like that? um so enter Ren'Py, the open source Python based game engine, which I have been mentioning all up till now, but I really feel like it was important to give the context of like what it can do and why it is important. So there are games made in Ren'Py from NaNoRen'O. So NaNoRen'O is like this month-long game dev sprint that's popular in the community, just like globally. People just like form teams. It's kind of like a month-long hackathon that happens every year, but globally. So there's like other kind of like game specific ones, but NaNoRen'O is one for visual novels. And from those kind of like mini hackathon sprint games to high budget games, they can all be used with Ren'Py. And it's open source, and the creator PyTom, his philosophy is that he wanted to make the best way to make visual novels and give it away for free. And I think that is one of the main things that it's able to be widely adopted. And just, there's more and more of these games coming out. And I mean, it kind of ranges, right? Like, as I mentioned, there's like from sprint games to like hackathon games to like big studio games. So definitely helps with the way people can kind of enter and start making their own game. And of course, like again, I want to mention that because OOP is pretty standard in game development already. So let's say you're using another engine like Unreal Engine, which is C++, or if you're using like Unity Engine, which is based in C Sharp, then you would still be able to translate a lot of those design patterns into just this engine. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about some of Python's kind of functionality, or well, Ren'Py specifically. Um, you can actually do a lot of screen customization. I'm going to show more visuals after, but what I mean to show here is that like it's it also tries to be more user friendly in a sense, because Python knows that a lot of people didn't necessarily come into using Ren'Py with like a programming background. So it actually has its own kind of like Ren'Py language in a sense, which it has like its own lexer and parser for like non-programmer friendly syntax, and there's like pretty good documentation there. But I'm going to show examples which are just like Python you're going to recognize. But I'm just saying that if you see code that's like this, which does not look like Python, it's because in the background they do have a custom lexer and parser for this kind of more friendly syntax. So I guess I'll start with one really popular game, which was like made like 2 years ago or something. It probably has over 2 million downloads, and it's called Doki Doki Literature Club. But I mean, don't let the name fool you. It's kind of like a horror, like psychological horror game, and with jump scares and all that stuff. It was made in Ren'Py, and there's actually a massive modding community around it. Like people make like fan games of it, and of course they're using Ren'Py to do it, and it's just like you can do pretty creative like graphical things with Ren'Py. And this is just like a small example because this does not look creepy at all, but people are like, oh, like this game really creeped me out or like really scared me for the first time in a long time. stuff like that. So you can definitely do that with Ren'Py. And there's kind of different types of transitions. I'm just showing a kind of image of different transitions that you can use, but these are pretty basic because I just wanted to find the first video that I could. But there's like many others that you could do. Um, and the reason why I show that is like it's actually fairly simple to use. Like you can actually go into the engine because the engine is open source, and you could all tweak like the kind of underlying way that these kind of image and animations are built. You could actually go and tweak that. But they've made some, I guess, default classes and stuff like that, which you could use. So image dissolve is one of the kind of default classes in which you can supply it an image, and then different backgrounds will animate or transition into each other. So I literally just like took the PyLadies logo and then used one of the default transition classes to make this in like 3 seconds. But okay, the point being that there's a lot of stuff when you think about it that are common in visual novel type of gameplay, right? Which is like dialogue boxes, characters, right? All of those are classes, and you can modify them as you wish and use them as you wish. So Ren'Py can also deal with fairly complicated like variables and stats tracking. So this is a game called Long Live the Queen. So every day you choose like different tasks, and you're building like a strategy, like the build of your character to survive like assassinations and stuff like that. So we can track like a huge amount of like different kind of like combinations of stats and interactions with the other kind of characters, and do like stats checks and stuff. So it's a fairly complex game, and that was also handled in Ren'Py. So I think like there's a lot of potential for gameplay and different varieties of games. And this is another one which is like kind of like a user made mod, but it's like very like it's been used in like larger budget games. So I would say like apart from this game, there's like other games from bigger studios that use this kind of 3D-ish camera mod. So it just kind of like does these transforms, and it makes it look like 2D objects are 3D because it kind of like layers them and then does these transforms. So this is also done in Ren'Py. So you're able to have like a pretty flexible view, even though it's not like real 3D. Otherwise, I would suggest you to just use Unreal or Unity. And you can definitely customize everything a lot just by knowing Python, and you can make the UI look extremely flexible and just like versatile according to your own design. So I just wanted to showcase a bunch of those games that made use of Ren'Py so that you can kind of have like an idea of what you could be doing with Ren'Py. So this is my game, and yeah, it's like I just had the idea to make a timer. So in the game that you can make choices, and you can do things like it's kind of like remember like if there's a bad scenario, like what are you gonna do? And then when the player reads it and they choose one of them, it will just like tell you how long it took to make that choice, and then just like have a little snippet of dialogue after that. And I was just using Python to do this. So you can honestly like it's just like, oh yeah, you make like another class and you import random and you import time. Like this is something I guess like for people using Python, these are just like the most kind of simple like standard library type things. And you will definitely recognize it. And just by knowing this, I was able to implement that into um the game because yeah, Python. Yeah, I don't have a better explanation. And you can use like things that you can definitely recognize as a Python user, like decorators, and you're just like, oh yeah, like, oh, I just thought of this. I can just implement it because I can translate the thought from with Python to what I'm imagining in my head for this game. And just to kind of like grab random dialogue, so it's not always like great, 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 right? It's like it can choose from like interesting, whoa, or stuff like that. I just like randomly grab something from a list of words with random. So it's something that you can, I guess, for someone learning Python or just beginning with Python, like these are things that you would be able to recognize like fairly early on as well. So it kind of took away, it definitely, made game development more um kind of less intimidating to me because I was able to translate these game design ideas into code. Yeah, so the final kind of this small feature was just, yeah, like it'll tell the player how long it took, and then it'll just like have some random dialogue after that was pre-written, but it will like randomly select from it. So that kind of makes the gameplay less like repetitive sometimes, or like it's kind of like how NPC dialogue, like sometimes you talk to someone and they say hi, sometimes they say good morning. So it makes it a little bit more dynamic. And I want to say that because Bandersnatch on Netflix is one of the more popular things that people know that are like this kind of storytelling, which is like, oh, things happen, make choices, and the world changes because what you're doing in the game world. So you can actually remake Netflix's Bandersnatch and Ren'Py. I think that's like fairly like straightforward to do, and its creator actually said that they'd use Twine, which is a popular tool to kind of manage story, that they actually use that tool to make the storyboard for Bandersnatch. So that kind of goes to show how like you can use this kind of narrative, visual novel driven gameplay in like many mediums as well. Yeah, so I want to say that, yeah, like your imagination is pretty much the limit with Ren'Py, unless it's a like a 3D heavy first person shooter, or like online like a MOBA game. Yeah, don't use Ren'Py, please. But like if you want to make something that is like those like kind of 2D strategies I showed you, or kind of like visual novel driven games, then yeah, this one is really great to use. And I honestly think there's a lot of things that I can just think and I can just code, and then it'll come out on the game. So it's new programmer friendly because, as I mentioned, it has some, there is some kind of like Ren'Py language that is able to make the code more readable and more kind of understandable for non-Python programmers. And it's also flexible for seasoned devs because you can literally go into the engine, you can do whatever you want, or you can just like make whatever like custom objects that you want. And so, yeah, I think like thank you, Ren'Py Tom, who is the creator, and there is also a lot of contributors, well, some contributors, but you can also, go and make a pull request because it is open source on GitHub, so you can find it. So yeah, I think that was uh, like one of the things that I really like about Ren'Py because it really kind of just like makes it less intimidating. And right now what I'm working on actually is like this kind of second game, and then I just like wanted to make this kind of like card screen. It's still heavily work in progress, but I mean it's like doing what I wanted to do, and it's starting to look good. I'm still working on it, but I'm also doing this in Ren'Py. So there's a lot of possibility there. You can definitely make kind of like a large amount of games if you want to, different varieties. So yeah, this was like the first game that I made, and then what I just showed you is like a work in progress. So yeah, that would kind of conclude the talk, and I would encourage you to go translate your story game ideas into like a real game. So yeah, you can find me at these places. For on Twitter, it's like my game studio handle, which is Quill Studios, and then on my LinkedIn, which is more, I guess, data science slash video games, as well as my website susanshu.com. And you can find the game on Steam as well as Switch, Xbox One, and PS4.